I'm Dr Stephanie Minchin, clinical psychologist, yoga teacher, and soon to qualify as a yoga therapist, presenting a conversation today with Vanessa King from Action for Happiness. And this is part of our Mental Health Awareness Week programme at More Yoga, that we are trying to encourage more conversation about mental health, particularly thinking about yoga as a healing tool, of course, and also trying to link it in with our project More Mind, which is ongoing work about how to promote positive mental health and emotional well-being. So I'll shortly go on to introduce Vanessa, but I'd just like to speak to how great the charity is with Action for Happiness. So I first discovered Action for Happiness maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, in my earlier days in London, when I was getting more into sort of the mindfulness journey. I started attending a couple of talks, anything from sort of Buddhist monks to well-being writers, and now I think some of you that maybe follow me on social media see I dedicate the daily calendar every day and share it at work, and it's just behind my computer screen. So there's Action for Happiness is a charity with over 183,000 members, I think.
Yeah, and our online community is well over 1 million. So we have a kind of, so people that sign up to sort of the pledge, as it were, to be kind of formal members, is over 180 countries as well. So it's great. So yeah.
Fantastic. And as an organisation, offer sort of free online learnings, talks, lots of materials and resources, and it is a real privilege to have Vanessa sharing some insights today. So Vanessa, over to you if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work and Action for Happiness to start.
Okay, yeah, so I'm Vanessa King. I'm the head psychologist at Action for Happiness, and my focus is on the psychology of well-being. So I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I'm the psychology of well-being. Actually, I spent a lot of my career as an organisational psychologist.
Great.
So yeah, but I started this journey. So I took sabbatical, went to study in the States with Martin Seligman, who you would know.
Yes.
And did my master's there with him. And then ever since, I've been involved with Action for Happiness since before it started. And we're 10 years old next year, and it's been an incredible journey, really, from a small kind of charity with a very small core team, how that has kind of grown as a world. And our kind of real approach is, how do we take science? The sort of psychological literature, neuroscience, the mindfulness literature, which I would sort of include in that bucket, is the research, the scientific research on those areas has just ballooned in the last, over the last 20 years, but particularly in the last 10 years. It's huge. And there's lots of good learnings, lots of good insights there that we can apply in our own lives. But how do you get it from these kind of academic papers into people's practical lives, which is what my key role is how do you translate this kind of scientific research into really practical things that people can do for themselves, and more importantly, well, not more importantly, but as importantly, with and for other people. And so one of the things that I've did at Action is create our framework called the 10 Keys to Happier Living, which is it's an evidence-based framework. So it's based on all the kind of areas, not all the areas, but the key areas the research findings show that we can take action in our own lives, for us and to contribute to other people's lives. So the acronym is Great Dream, which people love, because who doesn't dream of being happier? And of course we dream of having a sort of happier, kinder society, which is Action for Happiness in a way is using that science and communicating that in practical ways, finding ways to bring people to connect with each other, to catalyse a happier kind of world. Really, I see us as a sort of catalyst for that. So yeah,
really fantastic work. Really fantastic work. And what I really admire is how it's based, like you said, on research evidence, and actually it's translating that from the sort of the psychology and the science into everyday tips, like how is this accessible? What are the small steps that each and every individual can possibly make to kind of work towards that journey of happiness?
Yeah, yeah. And it's when we tend to, I was very specific when we developed the framework, the 10 keys, we didn't call them the 10 keys to happiness. That's my alarm for this. I manage my time by alarms for our meeting. Actually, no, that's the one for the next meeting. Don't mind. Get an advance warning.
Please.
So,
funny.
It's a great way, actually. What were we asking before we were so rudely interrupted on my phone?
About the acronym and
the name. So we were very deliberate, and I feel particularly strongly that we don't call them the 10 keys to happiness. We call them 10 keys to happier living, because it's really important. I think this goes along with the evidence base, that this is not about you do these 10 steps and then you'll be happy forever. I mean, life has ups and downs, and that's part of life. And knowing how we cope with those and deal with those, and how we can be a little bit more resilient, how can we learn to the things that enable us to be happy are actually things that build our resilience as well, is actually recognizing that is really important. Because if we expect that I do these 3 things and I'm going to be happy forever, then you're setting yourself up for disappointment. But it's actually, being grounded and saying, wherever I'm feeling right now, wherever I am right now, there are some things I can do that help me feel happier. Whether that's in a good place and I want to sustain that and maintain that, or whether I'm actually not in a great place and there is, what are the things that I can do to just help myself feel a little bit better.
Yeah. I think that's so important that you've touched on that point, because happiness in itself isn't a fixed state. It's not a permanent way of being. It's totally transient and depends on so many different factors. And I like this idea of the happier living, because even in acknowledging, okay, I feel sad today, following one of those steps, what could make me feel a little bit less sad?
Exactly. It's so important, and I think it's also, I see one of my mission in particular is kind of helping people unpack happiness, because it's a word we actually throw around a lot. I'll be happy when, I'll be happy if this made me happy, that didn't make me happy, blah blah blah. But we don't actually spend much time thinking about, well, what does happiness really mean, and then what does it mean in terms of how I live my life? And I think it's, the ancient Greeks talked about 2 different sorts of happiness. They talked about hedonia, sort of pleasure. It's where our word for hedonism comes from, which is, in our language, that there's too much of a good thing. But actually, a bit of pleasure on the way is really important. But the ancient Greeks also, the ancient Greeks also talked about a form of happiness called eudaimonia, which is kind of more akin to fulfillment, living a good life, or they would have said a life of virtue, and living a life that's to the best of what's best within us as well. So, and it's kind of interesting, because actually if you're working towards things that are fulfilling, things that are, you're helping to make a difference in the world, or helping to bring, use your strengths and talents more fully, that's not an easy journey. And there'll be ups and downs, if you're working towards fulfilling relationships, those don't always go smoothly. So it's kind of, so I think these 2 forms of happiness actually kind of work nicely side by side, because the moments of pleasure, albeit fleeting, help us, on the way to this kind of more eudaimonic happiness, this sense of fulfillment. So these kind of moments of pleasure, moments of joy, moments of calmness, serenity, some of the things that we get from yoga can help us towards a sort of greater fulfillment and meaning in life. So, but often when we throw the word happiness, and certainly in the media and the advertising stuff, it's very much focused on the pleasure side of things. So it's so I'll be happy when I get the latest, newest iPhone, or I get a kind of new pair of shoes, or I go to that newest, bar or restaurant, whatever your thing is, I'll be happy when. But of course that, we get a hit of pleasure, of course we do. And it's great to appreciate that. But then of course that wanes very quickly, and we need the next hit. So without that balance between the hedonic and the eudaimonic, I think, you know, it's a, they call it the hedonic treadmill. So, you know, because you've got to keep going on it. So without that balance of the eudaimonic side. So I think that's really, sorry, that makes me going, so it's a bit of a thing.
And also that happiness, like you've mentioned, isn't based on attachment to external things, and particularly in modern society where we have benchmarks around salaries, identities, the kind of gadgets, all of those things. Like one of the sort of key values in yoga philosophy is called santosha, which is about contentment. And in some ways that sort of also speaks to this sort of inner peace, regardless of the sort of chaos that's, you know, life will throw at us and different challenges. Actually, how can we find that sort of inner calm, which I think also speaks to happier living as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And we one of the keys is around awareness and living life mindfully. But of course, I mean, actually, the keys aren't neatly, you know, they're neatly packaged to communicate, but of course in reality they interweave. So we know that, you know, if we develop that sort of sense of inner calm, whether through yoga, whether through mindfulness or other practices, that then helps us kind of manage the kind of what's going on in our mind and those thoughts, and not get too caught up with status and identity and stuff, which is hard to do. And you know, we're in a society where that stuff's around. I think it's changed. It's maybe changed. We're having a conversation with it just this morning about this. You know, I think it's maybe this whole lockdown situation has really helped in some ways, because people can't go out. You're not going out shopping. You can't go out to the things that you normally do. The things that you actually, when you go, does probably driving us towards social media a bit more, which has its problems. But it is making us maybe appreciate a little bit more the beauty around us. And I think it is really important. It's not to say giving up and living a totally sort of, how do you pronounce it? Aesthetic. It's not aesthetic. You know, kind of a pared down Spartan life. I mean, it's okay to have, you know, to, you know, enjoy wearing a nice shirt or a nice jewelry or have some lovely flowers or whatever. It's really, that's okay. But it's when everything is placed on that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and for sure, it's easier. Life is in some ways a little bit easier if you're not worrying about the next bill, you know. But you know, so I think we can't, you know, it's not realistic to say none of that external stuff matters, because in our society it does, but it matters far less than the emphasis we place on it. And you know, that really kind of compromises our ability to feel happier with ourselves and focus on what really matters. So yeah.
And given that it's Mental Health Awareness Week focus this year on kindness, and you know, think of course it's a similar positive value. What does kindness mean to you, and how do you sort of practice it? How do you welcome it in?
Well, I think kindness is really important. It's one of those. It's actually really at the heart of the Action for Happiness movement. In fact, the first two keys in the 10 keys are, so the G and the R in great are giving, which is about being kind to others, and relating, which is nurturing our connections with others. And actually, and the end of dream, the A and the M at the end of the acronym are about acceptance, which is self-acceptance, so being kind to ourselves, self-compassion, and meaning, of course, which is kind of a nice circular thing with giving. So I think kindness is, what does it mean to me? I think it means, in my sort of personal journey, it's been a sort of bit of being a bit more aware of how I am with others, how much I notice others' sort of needs, and also how I notice how I'm treating myself. So, because often we can be, when I work with groups, you know, often run workshops and things around things like self-compassion and self-acceptance, and it just makes me almost weep how when people share how tough they're being on themselves. You know, it's like this really harsh critic, and what that's doing is it's triggering the threat systems in our emotional brain. And Albert Ellis, who's the father of cognitive behavioural therapy, said we're remarkably good at disturbing ourselves. So when our forebrain, our human brain, is kind of coming up with that, oh, Vanessa, why, you're the only person in the world that does that, why are you so crap at that? That's actually triggering the threat systems in my more primitive emotional brain, which is causing me to feel fear, anxious, shame, and that causes me to kind of almost like withdraw a bit from life and not make the most of, all the kind of the strengths I've got, and acknowledge the weaknesses. I mean, I think that's it, is, everybody we meet has a bunch of strengths, and they have a bunch of things that they aren't strengths. So I think that, and recognizing that, accepting that, is a really important journey. I mean, Paul Gilbert, I don't know if any of your viewers who will have heard of Paul Gilbert, who's a big, a big hero of mine. He says, unless we're compassionate to ourselves, he calls it the flow of compassion. I can't be as kind to other people. So I think I think that they're interlinked, kindness to ourselves and kindness to others. And we can actually give too much. So if we're over giving on a sustained period, that undermines our own well-being, then we're not able to help people going forward. So I think I think self-compassion is the hobby, but I think it's also, I've been really struck in this period of lockdown how the extraordinary acts of kindness, just in my street. I mean, I live in a typical London street. It's about 90 houses, really, mixed, some rented, some flats, some little tiny houses, little terraces. And, just somebody who'd actually has been through a really tough few years in life, set up a WhatsApp group at the start of all of this. And more people are joining from the street. And, I actually had suspected COVID right at the start. And I was in isolation on my own for 2.5 weeks. And normally I'm pretty independent. I, do my own things, sort of thing. But I thought, God, it'd be really helpful. I can't go out. I need some food. I'd love to read a newspaper and stuff. Weekend. So I just used the WhatsApp group, and I just had such lovely things. And somebody rang me up and said, messaged me and said, Vanessa, do you fancy a cauliflower and chickpea curry? And I said, yeah, great. Within an hour, this package arrived on my doorstep with homemade cauliflower and chickpea curry, homemade naan bread, homemade raita, a little napkin and a little card all bundled up. It was so sweet. Somebody dropped me a little slice of pineapple upside down cake, just lovely. And then somebody did a little vintage tea plate, appeared on my doorstep with some flapjacks and some tea bags and a tiny little wee hand-drawn card saying enjoy some afternoon tea, sort of thing. So lovely. And then we just had last night, we've got some classical musicians who are of course all out of work, and really don't know when they're going to be working again, and they've started after the clapping on a Thursday playing just a few tunes. It's just wonderful, because you just see these people coming. We're keeping our distance, of course, just slowly people coming sort of out from their kind of gardens into the street to look, and it's just magic. It's so beautiful. And then we had my next door neighbour is on her own. She's 87 at the beginning of May, and sort of found out it was her birthday, so she's completely on her own, which is one of the things that the WhatsApp group has helped us identify as who's on their own. And so we decided to just have a little tiny celebration. So the musicians agreed to play Happy Birthday, and then someone made a cake, and so knocked on the door. I said to make sure you're in at 4:30. She didn't really kind of know why. And then we played this Happy Birthday and had this social distancing. She sent a card afterwards saying, that is the best birthday present I have ever had. I was like,
7 years.
10 minutes to organise. I mean, baking the cake took a bit longer, but it's just like those tiny. So I think I think what this time has allowed us to do is slow down and notice opportunities for kindness. And we know from the research evidence, I mean, I think it's I think So we know from the research evidence that helping others actually activates the reward centres in our own brain. So it's not just good for the other person, it actually gives the giver a well-being kind of boost as well. And it also, I mean, it takes our mind off our own worries and our own anxieties. And it's very easy at times like this, particularly, to get sucked down and ruminating and catastrophizing and suck right down. So actually focusing on somebody, what can I do for someone else, gets me out of that loop. It also helps me feel that actually I've got something to contribute and offer, however tiny. And then we also know that happier people help others more. So there's a kind of virtuous circle. I describe it as the virtuous circle. For me, it's a sort of social glue. I'm quite influenced by sort of evolutionary psychology. My original degree was psychology and biology, so combined. So so if you think about it, so if we know that helping other people helps us to be, being kind to other people helps us to be happier, and happier people help more. You can think, I kind of think of it as a social glue, because we are social creatures. I mean, whether we like to be around lots of people or not, we are a social species. So I think it's evolved, and I think we've had a period in history. I mean, there's a guy called, I think he's called Rutger Bregman. He's got a book out at the moment. Apparently it's gone really viral in the UK, interestingly, more than he's from the Netherlands, more than when it came out in the Netherlands. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History. And actually he's gone back through history and said, this current narrative that we have that we've had, certainly in the last century, that it's a dog eat dog world, it's individualistic, and it's the fittest person wins, kind of, it's survival of the fittest, and it's very individualistic and competitive. He's saying it's actually not true. It's actually that is not our nature. And there's lots of other research out there, sort of clinical research, anthropological research, that is looking at actually human beings are actually a naturally kind species, actually cooperative, collaborative species. And it's not just about the survival of my genes, it's actually about helping our kind of species survive, really.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting. So I think I'm burbling all over the place.
No, it's so interesting. It's all flowing. It's amazing. Actually, if anything, Vanessa, you've touched on answering questions even before I've asked them, because I was thinking about kindness to ourselves, kindness to others, kindness on a more sort of relational community world level. And actually what you're describing is that we the kind of positive reward and effect of connecting, the kindness in the relationship, how it kind of snowballs, and it's almost like a domino effect. Like it just keeps going, and perhaps it's not a survival of my genes, but a survival of our genes.
It is, yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely it. And I think it's, and we know that from the sort of economic literature that when you look at the thing called the World Happiness Report, which looks at the happiest countries, but it's done by economists rather than psychologists. I mean, it's good stuff. But they've found that even in countries, the most resilient communities are those with where people feel supported. It's if we can go out our door and feel, even just knowing who your neighbours are, you don't have to, know their life story, but just knowing to say hello is really boosts our well-being, reduces fear, helps people feel a sense of belonging and connected to their community, and that's good for everybody. And we certainly know that things like being kind, those things there is a sort of contagion effect, and they call it the ripple effect. Kindness, that if I see somebody be kind, I'm actually more likely to be kind to someone else myself. So it's quite, and and it's interesting looking at sort of research evidence like that, because it actually shows that we all have a responsibility. It's a real, and these, I think, sometimes the greatest act of kindness we can do is just giving somebody a moment of our attention. For example, homeless people, often say the most difficult thing is people see through them, they don't look at them. They don't connect with them as a person. In fact, I think the sort of psychological research suggests that we actually often our interactions with homeless people is more as if they were an object than a person. But so that moment of attention, that power of attention, is a really powerful. So if you've got nothing else you feel you've got to give, you can just give someone a smile and attention. And what I'm finding, so I'm bumping on, I have to go.
I'm so
Can I say, I guess I love this thing that I noticed during this whole period is, as we're sort of walking around social distancing and, being conscious, being a bit more mindful of the people around us and where we are in relation to them, and, maybe keeping a bit of a distance. But I've found that's actually made, even though we're kind of moving apart from people, which in ordinary times you'd think, oh, why is somebody kind of, stepping away from me? It's kind of been a moment of connection, and I'm finding people smiling at each other. Which is actually really nice. Like we're doing this kind of weird thing that was strange sort of dance, but it's lovely, and it's and that is in itself a moment of kind. Just being that little, bring a bit of levity, a bit of smile, a bit of thing, and that is that's nice for us, and it's nice for the other person. So it's. I think there's a great Dalai Lama saying, saying, sort of, be kind whenever possible. It's always possible. So yeah, and I think I've just switched all the other things. I think this is also really important, as we often don't think about this. And I am burbling. When we're sort of, particularly when we're in lockdown with flatmates or with family or partners, it can be a pretty intense environment, and it's very easy, particularly if we're kind of feeling a bit kind of worn down by it all ourselves. It's just to snap back, to just respond to somebody with something. And sometimes an act of kindness is just noticing that you're about to do that and pausing. So it's kind of what's the kindest way I can respond here? Now, sometimes, we want to talk about the fact that something's making us angry, but there are kind ways of talking about that, kind of them just blowing off the handle. And again, there's thinking about kindness in those tiny little micro interactions, even with our nearest and dearest, or our physically closest people right now. So, anyway, I must go there because I was supposed to be on another call at 12:30.
Well, just before you go, how can people follow the work of Action for Happiness? Where can they find you?
So Action for Happiness, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. We're at Action Happiness, so we miss out the 4, I don't know why. At Action Happiness, we've got actionforhappiness.org is the website. There's a load of free resources. We've got these lovely monthly calendars which are based on the 10 keys to happy living, each there's a tiny little action per day, and they're lovely things. And you can also go on the app. There's that free app that you can download in the App Store, both Android and iPhone, and that has the calendars in there and little things. And just sign up, join us, and then you'll find out we've got some online talks and stuff coming on. I'm about to do a series of little mini live videos and things on the 10 keys of the book, 10 keys to happier living. If you want to know a little bit more about the science and some reflections, it's a very practical book. There's that, and there's a kids book actually based on, it's called 50 Ways to Feel Happy, which people love because it's very beautifully illustrated, so not by me. But so there's loads of ways to find out, but we'd love the community to kind of your community to join our community because they're interconnected, and I'd love to spend more time talking to you about yoga and psychology.
I really appreciate you making the time. Honestly, I'm a big sort of fan and advocate of Action for Happiness. So it's a total pleasure talking. So yes, thank you.
Lovely to see you.
Yes, okay, all right. Thank you, Vanessa. Take care. Bye.
So I would love to catch up because I'm really interested in the connection. Your background, clinical psychology, yoga therapy. It's very interesting.
Absolutely. Well, let's email.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Good luck with it, and let us know when it's. I'll email you with our tag. If you email me, then I'll email you with our tags and things like that.
Yes, I'll put all that in an email for sure.
brilliant, because my tag on Twitter is @changespace, so it's not obvious. So yeah.
Okay, I'll put it in an email now
on Instagram as well. So anyway, all right.
Thank you so much for making the time. Take care. Bye. Okay, so just to finish that talk, thank you so much for listening. There was so many sort of golden nuggets in there, both sort of thinking about practical tips to kind of the science behind happiness, kindness, the sort of shared values and actions between them. So I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Yeah, continue to follow us at More Yoga, particularly the More Mind Project, which is all about mental health and using sort of yogic practices to promote well-being. So thank you for listening. I'm Dr Stephanie Minchin at the Yoga Psychologist, and I hope to see you soon. Thanks, bye.